Earthquakes in Japan, Haiti, and Chile. Are these signs that we are living in the last days and that the rapture is about to occur? Modern-day prophecy writers, anytime something like this happens in our world, the Chilean earthquake, the earthquake in Japan, and certainly the one in Haiti, and the tsunami of 2004, the prophecy writers start cranking out more and more literature telling us that these are signs that the end is near, that the rapture is right around the corner. And they base this on the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24, where it says that there will be earthquakes and famines in various places. The argument is that it's the increase in the magnitude of earthquakes that is an indicator of the end times. Because as you can see, go back to the book of Amos, you can see that there was a great earthquake that took place there, and certainly in the New Testament era there were earthquakes. There was an earthquake at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. There was an earthquake in the book of Acts that opened up the prison. If you study the history of the time between AD 30 and AD 70, there were lots of earthquakes. In fact, if you study the history of earthquakes, you will see that there have always been earthquakes. So the argument is that today it's the magnitude and the frequency of the earthquakes that makes the difference. And yet the biblical text doesn't say anything about magnitude or the number of earthquakes. It simply says there will be great earthquakes. It doesn't say there will be more earthquakes. It doesn't say there will be an increase in earthquakes. It doesn't say that there will be the seismic measurement of earthquakes will increase. It simply says there will be earthquakes in various places, just like there will be famines in various places. And the book of Acts even mentions a famine in Acts chapter 11, verse 28, a famine that says it was all over the world. Now, the word that's used there is oikumene, which is the inhabited world, the world of their day. And so here you have a famine that is mentioned in Scripture. Some will say, well, these great storms, it's these storms that we had, Katrina and these other storms, these are indications that we're living in the last days. But look at the book of Acts, Acts chapter 27. An entire chapter is spent on a storm that nearly sinks the ship that Paul is riding on. I mean, they barely escaped with their lives. Notice the number of days that they are under the weather, that they couldn't see the stars at nighttime. They were just completely under a blanket of dark clouds. If you study the history of the Mediterranean, you'll note the number of ships that have been demolished because of storms. The Roman writers of the period described horrendous storms that took place. There's really nothing new about any of this. Part of what we have in our day are better detecting devices. In fact, the seismic, the Richter scale, how we measure earthquakes today, really didn't get invented until the 1930s. And so we can only speculate on the size and frequency of earthquakes before this time period, because now we have earthquake monitoring stations all over the world. And so anytime the earth shakes, and it's always shaking, we're going to get some indication of an earthquake. So we need to keep all of this in mind and not be sent off our prophetic loop because of this appeal to modern-day prophecy meanderings. And keep in mind that where these earthquakes took place, this was the fifth strongest earthquake in Chile. That means there are 4 earthquakes stronger than this, the strongest one being in 1960. But you go all the way back to, I think, the early part of the 1900s, that you'll see that Chile went through another horrendous earthquake. Of course, you had the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. And if you look at the root of these earthquakes, they're on earthquake fault lines. Right on the verge of the ocean and the land in Chile. Same thing in Japan. Same thing in Haiti. Everybody knows where these earthquakes are going to strike. An earthquake, I believe, an earthquake that would have prophetic significance would be one that was told about in a particular time frame, and also in an area which isn't necessarily noted for earthquakes. The earth is always moving and shifting. We're always going to see earthquakes. The earthquake that's mentioned in Matthew chapter 24 are earthquakes that were going to take place before the destruction of Jerusalem, which took place in AD 70, because Jesus said this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And in fact, the earthquake and the famine, Jesus points out, really aren't signs, and not to see those as signs, because they are common to every generation. Every generation has experienced earthquakes. In fact, this is something by John Wesley. I think Wesley wrote this in 1750, and he's describing a great earthquake that hit Sicily in 1692. And here's what he says: "One of the most dreadful earthquakes in all history. It shook the whole island, and not only that, but Naples and Malta shared in the shock. It was impossible for anyone to keep on their legs on the dancing earth. Nay, those who lay on the ground were tossed from side to side, as on a rolling billow. High walls leaped from their foundations several paces. The mischief it did is amazing. 54 cities and towns, besides an incredible number of villages, were almost entirely destroyed." So this was in 1692. But also in 1692, there was an earthquake in Jamaica, and Wesley described it in similar terms. "It threw down most of the houses, churches, sugar works, mills, and bridges throughout the island, tore the rocks and mountains, reducing some of them to plains, destroyed whole plantations, and threw them into the sea, and in 2 minutes' time shook down and destroyed 9/10 of the town of Port Royal. The houses sunk outright 30 or 40 fathom deep. The earth opening swallowed up people, and they rose in other streets, some in their midst of the harbor, being driven up again by the sea, which rose in those breaches and so wonderfully escaped." So here you have 1692. In the same year, 2 earthquakes, one in Sicily and one in Jamaica. So if you note that the Chilean earthquake, as I mentioned, was the 5th most powerful to hit the region in the last 110 years. And Chile had a 9.5 earthquake in 1960. And so none of this is new. And we are so provincial in the way that we understand our world. We think that when things happen to us, that it's important to us in prophecy. We do the same thing with war. We do the same thing with privacy issues regarding government intervention. We think if something isn't tied to Bible prophecy, you can't deal with it in a biblical way. And so when you look at the issue of earthquakes, keep in mind that every generation has had its share of earthquakes, and every generation has had its prophecy writers saying that these earthquakes are somehow a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And what we've seen in every generation, that they've all been wrong. We are still here. We still have to deal with the issues of the day. We still have to deal with earthquakes. Notice the difference in Chile's earthquakes and the one in Haiti. The differences in the worldviews. Chile got its act together, put together a proper way of dealing with earthquakes. The same thing happened in San Francisco. San Francisco may get another earthquake as well. Most buildings out there are built to withstand earthquakes. We have decided to live in places where earthquakes take place. The same thing in New Orleans. I mean, New Orleans is a city below sea level, and yet people decided to move there. And while it would have been a tremendous storm that rolled through there, man wouldn't have been affected very much, except that man wanted to live in a place by the sea. So once again, don't be pulled into the trap of looking at these earthquakes and seeing that the rapture is right around the corner. The same thing was said when Israel became a nation again in 1948, that a generation would not pass before the rapture would take place. A generation was 40 years. Add 40 to 1948, you get 1988. This is the year 2010. We are still here. We need to get off the prophecy roller coaster, get back on solid ground and do the work of the kingdom and proclaiming the gospel to all the nations, so people will begin to understand how the Bible can apply to every area of life in their day.
For more related to today's topic, check out Last Days Madness: Obsession in the Modern Church. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.